I love when I listen to someone and I could just write songs. You know, that is the way it is. You know, there's so much revelation that comes out of things, and I just loved it. And I can't wait for tonight, huh, everybody? And Jesus went up on a mountainside, and he called to him those that he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach. And he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out the demons. And then he names the 12. Jesus called to himself those that he wanted. Remember years ago on retreat, they asked us to go to the passage of blind man Bartimaeus, and so I did it, and this is what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to allow God to, ask us the question. Allow Jesus to ask the question, what can I do for you? And I thought, well, that would be easy to answer that. Because I felt like there were a lot of things that, I kind of was sitting in the room thinking, oh, that's an easy thing to ask, to answer, But once I allowed it, sit down, kneel at your bedside like you did when you were a little boy, maybe fold your hands, and then allow Jesus to ask you the question that he asked blind man Bartimaeus, what can I do for you? And I remember I evaded answering Jesus, actually, in the moment, because it was a harder answer than I had thought. And instead of answering the question, I started asking questions. And I said, Jesus, wasn't it obvious what blind man Bartimaeus needed? He was blind since he was born. Wasn't it obvious what he needed? He needed to see. I never really got to answering. I never really got to telling him what he could do for me. I just asked the question, isn't it obvious? And the Lord didn't answer me. And I remember vividly, the Lord answered me by the wind of the Spirit at 3 a.m. And it was an answer that I could get up and write down or forget it forever. So I got up out of bed at 3 a.m. with the answer. And the answer was like a whisper in the wind. It just said, because I don't want to just fix humanity. I want to know you. Jesus went up on a mountainside and he called to himself those that he wanted. From Shrek to Sunday school to everything. My whole life, I felt like, I just want to be used by God. But that rings out for me that Jesus didn't call to himself those that he just wanted to use. He called to himself those that he wanted. That I love that the longing to be with us, right? That he, just put your hands out like this and receive that from the Lord. That Jesus wants you. Yeah, I mean, Jesus will use you, but he wants you. And for me, I feel a release in that I am wanted by God. I love being wanted by God more than being used by God. And the older I get, the more I realize how beautiful that is, that Jesus still wants me. That even leading worship or all these things that we were talking about last night, even stages and all of these things, right? The crowds, all of that, they're really a danger. I heard there's a producer, Rick Rubin, who has a wonderful little book out that he just put out recently. But he and another producer, I'm forgetting his name now, just going off my. Do you remember Alfred? Who the other producer was? Is Alfred around? Remember who the other who are they talking to? The brother were out there. I can't remember. Anyway, another very famous producer, they're interviewing each other. And no. And he asks Rick, who's the most difficult artist to produce? And Rick said, the successful one. And he said, oh, why? He said, and he said, well, because the successful artist, Rick Rubin said, and the other guy said, well, I kind of like producing a successful artist because at least they're talented, and gifted. And he said, yeah. But I find that the crowd often produces in the successful artist really. What's that? Oh, thank you. T-Bone Burnett. And he said, Rick said, yeah, but I find that the crowd actually produces really poor habits in the successful artist. And T-Bone Burnett said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, like for instance, when I was producing Johnny Cash, he was sick at that time, and he would sit at the couch and he would play a song on his guitar, and he was trying to hide. He would try to re-perform or sort of recapitulate a younger version of himself, right? And he would be performing whenever I'd put the mics on him. But when he'd just sit on the couch and sing, that was what I wanted from him. And the crowd had produced in him these habits that he had gotten into that he couldn't leave behind. But there was something new to be heard. And many of you, I don't know if you know, but he was at the end of his rope. He was financially, at the end. He was, and so when Rick came, it was like, no, I want you to put all of those habits that you've created behind you. And what I'm hearing you do with the way it sounds, the sickness that you hear in your voice, that actually is beautiful to me. So I don't want you to hide that. I want to hear that, and people want to hear it. It's exactly what we need to hear. So the entire recording of the American records, if you listen to those, you can hear that. You can hear the sickness in his body. That's why, I heard myself today. See if I still. That's why that has so much power when you listen to it, because you can hear all of that age, all of that in his body. And the American records, I mean, quite possibly did better than any of the records that he had previously ever had, And the entire time he would record all those songs, he'd be playing a song. Rick would say, I'm going to set up now, but don't go to that other person initially. And then Johnny would just say, okay, get off the stage, Johnny. Get off the stage. Get off the stage, Johnny. Get off the stage. And then he would sing the song. Get off the stage, right? And so Jesus, his process with us as a worship leader, the goal of Jesus is not being on a stage in front of people. The goal is expansion and growth, development. Jesus says, I want you and I want to be with you. Why is it raining? Well, let's go on a journey. Maybe it'll take a year to figure it out. When you begin to awaken to why it's raining, the song will be over, right? You know what I mean? When you start to, you think you're waiting on the sun to open up the sky, but the sun, your son, eventually is going to open the sky on you. You don't even know what you're asking for yet, but sometimes I even wonder if Jesus allows himself to be surprised on the whole journey too, Jesus went up on a mountainside and he called to himself those that he wanted. So that he could be with us, to be wanted by God, to be loved by God. To realize that, I remember Father Gillick going on a retreat with Father Gillick one time, and he said, we want to make God, and that's that certainty thing again, we want to make God into a press. Like church and God, everything is like a press. And you bring in, a clump of clay or, dung or whatever, on the side of the hill, whatever it is. And then we'll shape it into something. And we got our machines. We'll put you on the church conveyor belt, or we'll put you on the church, like what would you call that? Like assembly line. And we'll put you on that church assembly line, and then we'll form you into something. The problem is that machinery, the reason that God isn't referred to as a press in the Bible, but a potter, is because the machinery doesn't care for the creation. Right? God's a potter, and Father Gillick, I remember, said this so beautifully, because he happens to be blind, even though I say happens to, because he can see a lot better than I can. When I'm with him, he's constantly seeing in ways that I can't see, but I have sight. So when I was younger, I used to think, oh man, wouldn't it be wonderful, Lord, if he could see, if you'd give him vision? And then I realized that, oh man, I'm the one that's blind. He's the one that can see, right? And so there he is. But the fact that he happens to be blind, he was like, I like to do pottery. And sometimes when I'm doing pottery, the pottery it'll move away from me. But the better I get at pottery, the more I don't try to force it from that, but reverence its resistance. So even when you're on the wheel and you're resisting, right? I'm going to reverence the resistance, and I'm going to use your resistance to shape and form you into your becoming. So I'm going to sit with you, and I'm going to say, oh, what are you becoming? What are you becoming by what you're, doing? I'm going to shape and form you, because I'm not a machine. I'm a potter. I care about you. We're wanted by God. Jesus says, I want to be with you. And I want you to be with me. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Everything that comes into being by being with God. Be still and know, I remember writing this years ago, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be. Because be is the beginning of beginning. Be is the beginning of believing. Be is the beginning of becoming. Be is the beginning of belonging. Be is the beginning of behaving. Be is the beginning of beloved and beautiful. If you see me, you've seen the Father, Jesus says, right? How can Jesus want us more than he wants to use us? Because before he ever healed a sick person or raised a dead person or walked on water or fed the 5,000 or fed the 4,000, he heard the voice of his Father say, before you do any of that, you are my beloved Son. On you my favor rests. So Jesus is just simply being what he's received. He's extending to you and me. If you want to know what God's like, he's always been like Jesus. It's so important to realize how much God wants us and wants to be with us. My daughter, Emma, a few years ago now, she's in her 20s, but she and I, her grandfather takes her out for Bible studies. And so I was kind of getting jealous at that time. And so I wanted to take her out for a Bible study. So I took her to her favorite place for pancakes in Milwaukee. And she was just little. And I thought, well, we'll just start at the beginning. So we just started with the story of Adam and Eve. And Emma said, we didn't even get hardly anywhere near, to the end of the story. And just from that beginning part, she looked at me and she's got pancakes coming out of her mouth. And she says, Daddy, isn't this a sad story? And I said, why is it sad, Emma? And she said, because I thought maybe from Sunday school or whatever, she was all ready to the fall, right? And so I thought, well, not yet. It's not sad. I mean, God's just creating Adam and Eve. And she said, well, I think this is such a sad story. I said, why do you think it's sad? She said, well, don't you think it's sad that they never got to be kids? And now I was thinking, well, who's bringing who on the Bible study? You know what I mean? And so we actually never got back to any Bible study because it was just such a huge revelation. And it comes only from a child. And if you look that up on the internet, it's not going to be in a book. It's going to be me talking about it because that's just how awesome a child's observation is, right? And I just was stymied by it. It was, oh yeah, I never got to be kids. And so it wasn't until I knew it was powerful, what she said to me. But it wasn't until later that I realized and discovered how theologically and anthropologically accurate Emma was just as a kid, right? Just with observation. That St. Irenaeus always depicted Adam and Eve as infants for several reasons, not the least of which was their need to grow into being fully human rather than just starting out perfect. Gregory of Nyssa, an important father of the faith, is famous for saying, actually, sin happens when we refuse to keep growing. That growth is an essential part of living. Even the universe grows. Most scientists believe that the universe will continue to expand for as long as eternity. And when God wanted to show us what he was like, he came as a baby and he grew into a man. He learned how to learn and listen and mimic and talk and walk and obey and fail and fall. He learned how to lose. Remember, I put that in a song recently called Forgiveness. Grieving is part of the journey, saying goodbye to who I thought it was. Forgiveness is our healing medicine. Forgiveness when we just can't forget. It's sharper than any sword and stronger than any war. It's not easy, but I know it's a gift from you. Well, that was okay for people, I guess, but the bridge is what I got a little feedback on it, which is, you're kind of hitting on something when you get bad, people get a little angry, the bridge, it says, you never said that it was easy, Jesus. You know what it's like to lose. It was the last verse I've ever written that I thought I would get such a, you're saying that Jesus knows what it's like to lose. I can't listen to your music anymore. I was like, well, that's probably a good idea, because I don't know. It's probably a good idea, because this is going to get worse. You know what it's like to lose. How could you say that about our almighty God? He never loses. I was like, whew, man, wow, what a bummer. Like, what a bummer to think that way. Of course Jesus knows what it's like to lose. In fact, I love to play tennis. That's kind of one of the things I did during 2020 is you could kind of be socially distanced and still play tennis. So I did a lot. And I wanted to get better and better and better at it. And now I play with a lot of 4-4-5s. And that's upper kind of level in tennis world jargon, at lower levels, obviously. And what you realize is and I tell this to my son, Oliver, who's learning tennis, he's 13. You got friends that they're completely, they'll never be a champion if they're not willing to learn you have to know how to lose. And I realize that's one of the gifts that I have in my tennis game, is because I realize that in the midst of a match, I might be down, and that person might even be better than me. But if they don't have the ability to let go of the match, they have a greater opportunity to lose than I do if I'm willing to let go. And I learned that actually even being in front of people, even leading worship, right? Is that if I don't let you go, I really can't lead you in worship. If I'm trying to control the moment, trying to tell you how to respond, are you even really worshiping? This is one of the great things you learn from Jesuits when you go. I mean, when I started doing that 25 years ago, one of the biggest difficulties that I had to get over was I had been raised on deductive preaching, and everything they do is inductive. So they want to awaken you, like we heard last night. They don't want the outside in thing. They want to awaken you from the inside. And when you're under that kind of teaching, they completely let you go. They don't expect any response. They just let you be. And all of a sudden, you almost sometimes think that you're coming up with it yourself. It's just coming out of you, right? Because they're awakening you from the inside out. And you have to, if you want to be a champion, you've got to learn how to lose. And I thought, wow, that's so amazing that people think that Jesus never knew what it was like to lose. I like to tell my children, when they were younger, that I don't say it as much anymore. Oliver's probably still into it because he's only 13. But, Oliver, when he was 6, right? Jesus was 6 once, Oliver, right? When it's his birthday. Or at that time, let's say, God was 9 once, Lucy. Or, Emma's turning 13. Jesus was 13 once, Emma. God was 15. He knows exactly what it feels like to be a 15-year-old boy, right? That in Jesus, even God grows. Jesus calls to himself those that he wanted so that they might be with him. That he longs to be with us, to spend time with us. So how does that happen? I'll never forget one of the first times, I sing a song like, let our hearts be awake. Every table's an altar, right? Or I remember, but how does that become a reality to me, right? That in worship, the experience, the activity is more important to God than just the expression. right? That it means more to him, the being with me, the growth, the processing, the journey. I'll never forget one of the first experiences of that was I was taking the kids, my youngest, my nephew Zane is his name, and my son Samuel they were like 5 or 6, and they were going to the Montessori school in Milwaukee. And Samuel, I told you earlier, he's a pretty focused kid, and A to B, I would say, they're linear thinker more, and I'm probably more of a circular thinker. And Zane is a beautiful kid. He's probably a little on the spectrum in that he thinks a lot more in circles, and super bright. Like when he was 5 years old, you could ask him what's 353,000 times 176,000, and he'd instantaneously know the answer. So Zane, he's 5 years old. It was crazy. It's out of the back of the car, he'd just tell you the answer. And Zane is a beautiful kid. And for some reason, in the family, he was always a little, out there, but he and I always got each other. And so he's in the back seat, and Sam's in the back seat, and they're having this discussion. Now, Samuel, my wife, was healed of barrenness, and miraculously healed of barrenness, not going to be able to have any children. Pictures of her ovaries are black with, endometriosis and all this stuff, and not going to be able to have kids. And then one night, the Lord touches her belly, and the power of the Holy Spirit comes over her, touches her belly, and she feels a hand on her belly, looks up, thinking that's weird because it feels like the hand of a man. And she was in this gathering kind of like this, and she was like, that's weird. They're not supposed to be touching my belly. And looked up, and there was nobody there, and she just felt this hand that was incredibly cold turn really hot. And literally, she knows it just sucked that infection right out of her body. And then we got pregnant not too long after that, and then obviously, and then I had a buddy of mine prophesy, and he said, I see a son rising in a mother's womb, and like Samuel, to the extent that you walk in the fear of the Lord and minister to the presence of the Lord, your son, an entire generation, will walk in the fear of the Lord and minister to the presence of the Lord and have favor with God and man and be like Samuel, So then we found out we were having a boy, and we were like, obviously his name's going to be Samuel, So we named him Samuel after our favorite Hebrew prophet, right? And then Zane is the son of a Palestinian Jordanian Muslim. And that's my brother-in-law. And so it's amazing life, and I've got a Hindu brother-in-law. So I got a Muslim brother-in-law, a Hindu brother-in-law. It's amazing Christmas. You know what I mean? It's actually kind of cool. I like it. But, I remember years ago, early on in me and Faraz is his name, Faraz's relationship, he would come and he would want to argue with me about stuff like theology, and I thought it was important for me to argue back, right, and to come up with good arguments. And then I remember one day I was reading about Mother Teresa and how she would just look into the eyes of those that she was holding, and I felt like the Holy Spirit just said, I don't want you to do that anymore. It was kind of like it started with a distaste for it. I just didn't want to be that kind of person. Why am I doing that? But I felt like the Lord said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to gaze at Faraz until you see me in his eyes. And then I just want you to tell him what you see. And so I started looking at his life, and then we'd get together for coffee, and I would just say, you're a really good dad, Faraz. Because he is. He was always really good with his children. Because the culture is very much, I'm this way too because of the way my father was, but Midwestern culture isn't generally real, they're side huggers. You know what I mean? We're not side huggers in my family, but they are. But he's not a side hugger. It's like tangible fathering, and in a pure way, pure touch, beautiful. And so anyway, I would just start telling these things. And then and to this day, we just have such a beautiful relationship because we don't argue about this stuff. What starts happening is I start to see him, right? It's like Jesus with Nathaniel, right? What good could come out of Nazareth? Jesus doesn't respond to Nathaniel with blindness. He responds to Nathaniel not with the Jacob ladder of a father who can hardly make out the difference between his two sons because he's so blind, right? But this God who sees, right? He doesn't respond to judgment with judgment. He responds to judgment with vision. I saw you daydreaming under the fig tree. You saw me, God. Now I believe. Now it's almost like Jesus laughs, right? In John 1. It's like, now you believe in me just because I said I saw you? Sometimes that's all it takes. It's just to see. And to respond with judgment, with vision, not with judgment. Well, you think nothing could come out of Nazareth? Well, I say nothing good come out of, New York City or whatever. You know what I'm saying? You get my point? And so, anyway, so just to give you a backstory on that. So I have Zane in the back seat. He's 5. Samuel's 6. And we're driving down the road, Lake Michigan, and driving to school. And they're having an argument in the back seat because Zane keeps asking Samuel, do you think we could be friends? And Samuel keeps saying, Zane, that's such a ridiculous question. Of course we're friends. We're cousins. And Zane, he responds and he says, no, that's not true, Samuel. That's not true. But you have to imagine a voice of a 5-year-old. That's not true, Samuel. Just because we're cousins, that does not mean we're friends. And I'm thinking, because of my creative mind, we got the flipping peace talks going on in the back. 2 cousins having an argument just because we're cousins, that doesn't mean we're friends. And there they go. Back and forth. Then we get to the school. It's only a 10-minute drive. Then we get to the school. We drop them off. So then I thought, we got to think of other things to do. Let's do math problems. Let's do this. Because I have them for the whole week. I'm driving them back and forth because Rachel and her sister were somewhere. Well, on the Thursday, I drive them and I decide, I'm going to play them. Because at the time, there was a real deep cut. You can't hardly find it anymore. But it's my favorite Andrea Bocelli record. It's called the Toscana record. And you got to go down a bit to find it. But it's a beautiful record, the whole thing, all the way through. And I thought, I'm going to play the Toscana record. And it was like a 45-degree, beautiful, sunny day on Lake Michigan Drive. And so we're driving up Lake Michigan, listening to the Toscana record. And it's just beautiful. And I thought, this is peaceful. And all of a sudden, out of the peaceful, Zane interrupts, right? Now, this is an important thing about spirituality and Jesus wanting us and wanting to be with us, is there's a lot of invitation and a lot of interruptions. And this is one of the most amazing things about the life of Jesus in the Gospels is how many times Jesus allowed himself to be interrupted, right? And so in our lives, interruptions are really important things about worship, about revelation, about the way God speaks to us, how much he wants to be with us and be present with us, and how much he wants us to be present to the, it sounds kind of cheesy, but to the gifts or the presence, the gifts of the present. And often what looks like an interruption to your life is an incredible invitation. So here I'm feeling like my peace is being interrupted by Zane from the back seat saying, Uncle Jason, I can't hear the music, Uncle Jason. So I said, okay, I'll turn up the radio a little bit more. So I turned up the radio. It was an old Land Cruiser I had. It had 300,000 miles on it. So it had that CD player in it. I turned up the volume a little bit. And a few seconds later, he says, Uncle Jason, I still can't hear the music, Uncle Jason. So I turned the radio up a little bit more. And then eventually, he asks again. I turn the radio down and I said, Zane, I can't turn the radio up anymore or it's going to hurt our ears. And then your mom's going to be upset with me. And he says to me, oh, Uncle Jason, I don't want you to turn the radio up. I want you to turn the radio off and roll down the windows. Of which I'm thinking, well, that's interesting because I thought he wanted to hear the music, but I just went with it. So I roll down all the windows. It's a 40-degree day, and the wind starts blowing, and the boys start howling, and they're having the time of their life. I turn down the radio, roll down the windows, and we're just driving down Lake Drive, and it's a 40-degree day. And you guys know this enough here. You're not like, if you turn down the windows on a 40, 45-degree day, and you're driving 30 miles an hour down a road, it's enough that you might be having a time of your life, but your eyes will start tearing up, and it's cold and frigid, but they're just laughing. And I look in the rearview mirror, and they're laughing so hard, and tears are streaming down their face. And tears are streaming down my face. And I'm actually kind of getting into it. And I had a big old sunroof on that thing. So I said, I'm going to roll back that sunroof, get some more air on this. So I roll back the sunroof, and more wind comes in. And I'm laughing, just listening to them laughing, right? And we get to the school. And Samuel, of course, is first one out. And he gets out. Teacher brings him in. Zane, he takes his time. Time enough for me to ask him. I said, Zane, because I'm like, okay, God, there's an invitation here. What's going on? And I'd written all these songs for all the children that were born to us in the family, Jacob's song and Hannah's song, all these songs I'd written. And I thought, oh man, I want to write a song for Zane, but I want to be sensitive to his dad. And I want to, how do I do this? So I looked back and I said, Zane, is that the real music, Zane? And at first I thought it was like the wind, and he looked at me like absolutely confident. He said, yeah, Uncle Jason. Just like this, he said, that's the real music. And then he got out of the car and just left me. And I went back I had this little worship room at our house there in Kensington Avenue there. And I sat down. It was like you still had to kind of dial up. And it was like slow. And so I was dialing up. I wonder what the name Zane means. So I start to research it. It's an Arabic and Jewish name. And you start to go through the whole. And then I get to Friend of the Wind and the Waves. And I'm seeing and then I'm seeing, in my imagination, I'm seeing Jesus walk, And I just sat down on the piano, turn down the radio. I want to hear. Turn down the voices hurting my ears. There's a moment getting away, and there's something I want to say. Roll down the window, and this is what you'll hear, the sound of a stranger's voice in your ear. Is it fear that has kept you away from the song and the wind and the waves saying, we can be friends if you want to. There's a friendship just waiting to be. We can be friends if you want to. Take my hand. Be friends with me. Beautiful music, memories and years of beautiful laughter and beautiful tears. It's a beautiful morning today with the wind blowing every which way. Beautiful people forgive and forget. Their eyes look like children who haven't lost yet. And trust is the strength of their love that disarms all the powers that separate us. We can be friends if you want to. There's a friendship waiting to be. We can be friends if you want to. Take my hand. I put that out in 2007. I have another version of it that's live on the Glimpse record. But, so then when somebody's like, oh, Jason Upton, he's just writing country music now. What happened to his worship music? It's not. How do you even respond to that? You don't respond to it. It takes too much time. You can't respond in the cheap world. What transforms our lives? Presence. What transforms being with? What transforms our worship? That Jesus is with us. That Jesus is in the midst of the car. That Jesus is in the midst of the interruption. That Jesus is saying, oh, you want to write songs and expressions? Let's get at that activity. You want to know why it's raining? Let me show you why it's raining. And about halfway through that song, you're going to get it. I remember I was sharing that song I did earlier just as reading the poetry of it. And I remember I read it to Father Gillick in one of my 15-minute sessions. And it was raining that day, I remember. And I'm reading that, up here in Milwaukee, because he's from Milwaukee, we got summer on our minds, and our dreams are filled with places where it's summer all the time. Death and resurrection are not options by design, for every garden has its season, and every season has its sign. And I remember I got to but death and resurrection, he stands up and he says, now you're getting it. And then he sits down as I'm reading, now you're getting it. You asked a question and Jesus took you on a journey. He said, why don't you come be with me? Why don't you spend time with me? You asked me a question. How about I ask you a question? Jesus wants to be with us. And Jesus wants us. Right? Jesus goes along on the journey. My brother just passed away, 53 years old. John, he was adopted. I was adopted. In lifelong alcoholism and drug abuse. And it kind of, in some ways, it's like the last 6 months of his life. He was just so present to it all. I remember I was waiting my whole life for my brother to say the words, I receive Jesus. And then I was in a produce section of a grocery store a few months back, and there's no way that was going to happen in a church. So I'm waiting in a grocery store line. Now, my brother is not the kind of person that you have flippant conversations about Jesus with. If you want to enter that conversation, you better be ready. And you might even have to be ready to get knocked in the face. Because he wasn't into any BS, religious stuff. But he and I, he really loved my parents. He's like, I don't know about church, but I love the God of my parents, he would say. I like that, but I don't get church, And then he and I would chat a lot, and especially the last 6 months. But we're in the middle of I'm in the middle of the Sendex grocery store up the street from us, in the produce, picking up stuff for Rachel for dinner, and my brother calls me, and he's not sleeping because he's having a hard time breathing, because his liver's gone, so they're taking liquids out of his body so that he can breathe a little bit, and so he's struggling with that, and he's like, Jay, it's just so hard for me to breathe, but I don't want to call mom and dad to come, and he's in Minnesota, I'm in Milwaukee, so I couldn't just come sleep there at night, and I'm just about ready to, maybe I should jump on a plane. And then his girlfriend would come over and stay the night, because he was just like, I feel like I'm going to suffocate when I'm trying to sleep, Jay. And I don't know how to ask, but I just said, oh, John, I said, are you scared of dying, John? Are you scared? And I didn't know how to ask that, And he said, oh, yeah, Jay. He said, he could hardly breathe. So his talking was, yeah, Jay, I am a little bit scared. I just don't know what's going to happen. I said, oh, man. I said, John, God so loved the world, but he really loves you, John. He said, he says back to me real quick, he goes, how do you know that, Jason? I'm just standing in a grocery store. How do you know that he loves me? It's just like one of those things that you could never answer for my brother. Well, the Bible says that God loves you. I said, John, I don't know. Just this is what came out of me. All I know, John, is that my heart is filled with no judgment towards you. My heart is only filled with love for you, John. And if my heart is only filled with love for you, John, then how much greater is God's love for you, John? And he began to weep, and I've never heard my brother weep. He begins to weep on the phone, and he can't breathe. So I said, John, do you want to talk with somebody? He said, yeah, I'd really love to talk with somebody. Do you have like a pastor or priest you can talk? He said, well, I went to the church, and they gave me this. I have it actually at my house now. They gave him a rosary for dummies. It's a rosary, which is just classic. He gave him a rosary for dummies. And he goes, I went to the Catholic Church and they gave me this rosary. It's called the rosary cheat sheet. That's what it's called. It's amazing. My father-in-law prays the rosary every day, and he's an amazing man. And so I showed him that at the funeral, the rosary cheat sheet. That's one of the things I kept. I wanted the rosary cheat sheet. He said, I went there and they just gave me the rosary cheat sheet. I said, that's amazing, John. That'll do. That's good. But maybe somebody to talk to. And I have this friend that is a pastor in West Virginia, Morgantown. And he is always he's done over 2,500 funerals. And he's with all sorts of overdose people. And I thought, Rev Kev. He's a barbecuer. He said, they're just going to have the time of their life. So I said, I'd just love you to meet Rev Kev. He said, yeah, if I'd be open to it. Well, within an hour, I had them on the phone, and they became fast friends. And over the next 2 months, they had all these discussions, of which Kev said, Jay, you're one of my best friends, but I can't tell you what me and John talk about because I have to gain John's trust, and you just need to know we can't discuss what we talk about. I just need John to be able to open up. But I've told your brother that he can talk about what we talk about with you. Well, then my brother calls me, and every night they would talk. Twice a week, he would call me, and for an hour, he would just tell me everything they talked about. And but the process of that, of being, and I watched, so I went back to that over and over. Why was that a moment where he began to weep on the phone? And I went back I remember it was in 2008. My brother was the kind of guy that I remember him being so high, he would take my mother by the throat and hold her up against the wall. And I remember one time standing there as the 4-year-old younger brother, 4 years younger, not feeling so weak, not knowing what I could do. And my brother being so high, he's holding my mom up against the wall, saying a terrible thing that I can't repeat here. But essentially, you couldn't have children, so instead of taking a hint from God, you decided to adopt and become a mother anyway. And I remember as a kid, I'll never forget certain things. You talk about curses that come out of people. I remember hearing those over my mother. So I remember in 2008 being on retreat, and the Lord said, kind of the same time I was dealing with Faraz, the Lord said, I want you to gaze at your brother until you can see me in his eyes. And when you can see me in his eyes, you'll be able to find me anywhere. And I remember I saw him. I gazed at him, and I saw Jesus in my brother's eyes. In the moment I saw Jesus in my brother's eyes, I could find Jesus anywhere. And I remember I wrote a song called Brother that's on a record. It's a live cut that we did in California somewhere that's on the Sunday morning record. It's a bonus track. I never have sung the song again since that moment. I wrote it and sang it and then never did it again. But the last of it, it says, brother, forgive me for my foolish pride. Brother, I see Jesus in your eyes. So right now, will you forgive me? Because forgiveness is exactly what I need. I remember walking through that process and asking him for forgiveness, and always it feeling a little strange. But now it fast forward to 2023, and he calls me, and I'm in the grocery store, and this had happened in 2008. But he never, you talk about like, I remember writing a thing that said, realizing what, Paul was talking about last night about forgiveness versus reconciliation. It's like, I remember sitting at the scene of the cross where Jesus, we never asked for forgiveness. We never even said we were sorry, but Jesus said, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. I remember that experience of like, we don't forgive people because they deserve it. We forgive so we can see again. So if we're waiting to forgive, right? That's what he was talking about last night. So I wanted to know how to see again, and I was like, I want to see. I want forgiveness to come, and I want to be able to see my brother the way you see him, Lord. It's like, I'm not a big Donald Trump fan, not to be political. I'm just not. I just don't like the guy. He just seems very rude to people. And so whatever your politics are, I just don't really like him. He could be Democrat, he could be Republican. I just don't like, and some people that's a big deal. And they won't even listen to my music because I don't like Donald Trump. Well, that's fine. I just don't like him. But it's not good enough to not like someone. I remember the Lord said to me, I want you to see Donald Trump. This is so weird. I do not like the guy. But if I can see him as a child, I can pray for him. I remember the Lord just brought me, I want you to bring you to what his childhood was like. Because I've prayed for all sorts of presidents that I don't agree with. Democrats, Republicans, and all sorts of different things. For some reason with him, I was blocked. I couldn't pray for him. Then I was in prayer one day. I was like, as long as I can see, I always tell it, as long as I can see Donald as a child, I can pray for him. It's weird, isn't it? So there I am, and I see my brother in that way. And I didn't realize it, so I realized the whole process of him reconciling with God, maybe it happened even before that. Maybe I'm not even fully aware. But that began, and it was so obvious to me that my heart was only filled with love. In fact, so much so that people would be like, my brother, I don't even know if he had expressed it, but I used to always be so intrigued by people that were not hopeful redemptionists, meaning that, you get to heaven and you're like just so excited to make sure that all the people that you didn't like or that hurt you weren't there. But for some reason, for me, I never felt that way in my heart. For me, I just wanted my brother to be there. He didn't have to say a special prayer to be there. He didn't have to go to church with me to be there. I would have had no problem with him being there. And then I started wondering, I wonder why people have so many problems with being there. I think in some ways it's sort of like, well, you didn't give up enough. I don't feel like I gave up anything to be a follower of Jesus. I feel like I gained everything being a follower of Jesus. I don't feel like I lost. My brother really like won it all, No, that's not how I felt. So I realized in that moment that had already began in my heart, and my heart wasn't filled with any judgment. It was just filled with love for him. And there was a lot probably to forgive, but I just didn't see my brother that way. But my brother hadn't really, he was like blown away by that. That's why he began to weep. So when I just flippantly said, I only have love in my heart for you, to me that was just first thing that came. But for my brother, it was as if it was like he hadn't gone from 2008 to 2023. He was still holding on to things that he was feeling judged, oppressed over, regret. And yet it had already been forgiven. And not only that, I got to watch my mother. And then not only, I used to always wonder if my brother liked me. I just wanted my big brother to like me, And then at the end of his life, he never tells anybody this, but at the end of his life, I get the call that I'm over everything for him. I'm to make the decision on his final breath. But I only have like a day to kind of like calibrate to that. And I remember having to be in the conversation with the doctors and my brother when they told him that there was nothing more they could do for him in the hospital, that your kidneys have failed, your liver is shut down, you have sepsis. All three of these are bad news, John. And my brother's saying, take this stuff out of my body. I just want to go home. And then having to communicate, but you know what that means, John? That means that you're going to have to sign some papers today because they're not coming to get you. I know what it means. My mother crying, my father crying, because that's the moment. That was the moment. And we bring him to his home that he bought in St. Michael, Minnesota. And for being such a non-religious guy, he loved to go to the Catholic Church. And he loved the fact that he would always tell my mother, you can see the steeple, Mom, from my kitchen. And I remember the day I walked in there, my brother did not look good the last several years of his life. But the day I walked in, he looked just like he did when I was a little boy. His coloring, his freckles on his face, because he was Irish. His curly white hair now, he didn't have anything in it. It was just beautiful hair. It's almost like he tried to hide the curl, but it was like so beautiful. And I just got to hold his hand and rub his head and tell him how much I loved him. And by this time, he had kind of gone into non-conscious. It seemed like non-consciousness, but all the doctors were like, hey, he can hear you. So be careful what you say around the bedside. And so my mother, though, that was it. My mother and my father. You want to talk about incarnation. That my mother, the same mother that I saw. I just gave you one episode. I have years. I didn't have any issues with my father and my mother growing up. All my issues came with the brother, which is probably why I get a little pissed off when I see people taking advantage of the church. And through the years, people say I'm like Keith Green. It wasn't like I'm not nothing like Keith Green. Keith Green was really mean to people. I'm very pastoral. I know that from Melody. I was like, Melody, you think I'm like Keith? She's like, Jay, you're nothing like Keith. You just get a little feisty sometimes. But I would always, in my early years, I'd get a little feisty when I'd see things in the name of prophecy that weren't prophecy at all. And then I was like, what do I do? I'm in front of all these people. I've got to say something. And my children will probably watch these videos one day, and I'll be ashamed that I didn't say anything. I'll just say something. Oh, God. And But I think some of that was sort of like watching, some of that, and then how that processes. And so you have to learn and grow how to deal with that stuff a little bit as you age, obviously. But what I got to see was all of that. The weird thing was, and even sometimes for me, cheapers. Like my brother would come to Christmas, and if you're an alcoholic, if you're around alcoholics, you know this. It's kind of funny now, but you can only make it for a day. So we would treat him like a king, but he'd only make it for a day, and then he'd be itching to get back, So he'd come all the way to Milwaukee for one day, and we would just make the day the best it could be. And, anyway, I remember at the dinner table sometimes, my brother, with my children, he would be like, oh my God, your dad, he's such a, he would say dumb shit or something in front of my children. He would say that, right? I'm not trying to make swearing the regular here. I'm just trying to give you the experience of the things that we experience, right? And they were at the table. And I remember there were times that I actually would be like, wow, I would never say that about my brother. And even times that I would say, I wonder why my parents don't ever speak up to my brother. Because my dad would, if he had an issue with me, he would tell me. But he would never say anything to my brother. And I remember another thing, isn't it? I remember there were times that I would say, oh, wow, why do my parents treat my brother completely equal to me? I've been there for them. Here I'm the younger brother acting like the older brother. You know what I mean? And that's why I had to say, forgive me for my foolish pride, right? I see Jesus in your eyes. What's the point? Well, there I am. I have all that in me, and then I'm going to watch my brother. And I came in, and he was just beautiful. And I'm holding his hand, and my mother would come in and say, okay, I've got to wash him. So she would take off all this, the diaper and everything. And I'm going to wash him. I'm going to wash his body. I'm going to wash his body. I'm going to wash his body. So for 3 days we're there, and she's just doing this constantly. And my dad is just holding him and hugging him and loving him and telling him things and telling him stories about fishing. And there they are just being together. And I'm watching incarnation happen. I'm watching them prepare my brother's body. And then the doctors came in and said, his heart is just so powerful. This could take a while. So, we had guests in from Holland and everything. So I said, well, I said what I have to say. And my mom and dad were with them and the nurses. And so I went home. I drove home with my friend from Holland. And the next day, my dad called me weeping on the phone. And my mother called me. And she said this. She said, because I have my buddy Rev Kev call. And when he was in that state and I was still there, I said, we got to have Pastor Kevin pray over him. So, they had a good relationship. So they put the phone up next to him. And my brother was unresponsive. But when he heard Kevin's voice, hey, this is Kevin, your pal. And I'm here in West Virginia. I don't know why they call this place almost heaven. You'll be able to find out probably pretty soon whether it's anything like heaven. I don't know if it's anything like heaven, and my brother did this with his head, trying to get close to that phone. And there he is, just holding his head like this. I don't know, John. I'm praying for a miracle. You could just get up out of that bed any moment now. And I believe for that entirely. I've seen it happen before. You could just get right up out of that bed, John. But it's quite possible, in the next couple of days, like Enoch, you're going to have a decision to make, John. Are you going to stay in your house, or are you going to go to the house of the Lord? And I just want to say it to you, John. When that moment comes and Jesus comes for you, you don't be afraid, John. You go on, brother. You go on to the house of the Lord. So I went home, like I said, because his heart was bummed. They said this could be several weeks because and what they were trying to help us realize is he's a young man. He shouldn't be dying. He just doesn't have a liver. He doesn't have a kidney, function. But he's got a heart, and it's pumping. So I went home, and then my mother, she called me, and she said, Jay, you won't believe it, but I went up, and I did what I did. I went up, and I wiped off John's mouth, And I put chapstick on his lips. And I caressed his head. And she said, I went and sat down on the couch. And at 7:15, I felt the sunlight come in through the window, that window where he could see St. Michael's from. I felt the sunlight come in through that window. And I felt it on my cheek. And then I looked. And it was just right on your brother John's face, just the sunlight shining on his face. And she said, I knew instantaneously that he had gone to the house of the Lord. And she said, I walked up and he just slipped away. No pain. What was I witnessing? Incarnation. Being with. That my parents, they were committed without judgment, without all the stuff in my heart. If you were to talk to my mother today, they planted a church when they're in their 70s. My dad learned the guitar in his retirement and works for Habitat for Humanity, learned the guitar so he could be on the worship team in the church that they planted up in the lake country of Minnesota with all their buddies. I just was there a few weeks ago to minister, and they have hundreds of people show up at this night of worship. And I said, some of you are here because you've enjoyed my music through the years, and most of you are probably here because my mom made you come. You know what I mean? So there my parents are, right? Giving their life to, they somehow, the miracle of it all, those wounds didn't hold them back from loving their son. They not only adopted that child, they chose through the desire, through want, through longing. We want to be with you, John. And we don't even know what that fully means. But for my brother, it was 53 years. Some of it was being held up against a wall. And then my mother just incarnationally loving my brother all the way till he's breathed his last, right? I'm going to wash you. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to love you because I chose and I wanted you, John. That's the love of God. Amen. That's worship. So if I could write a song that the whole world could sing about, maybe I will one day, you know what I mean? But something tells me I don't even know if you could write a song that the church would sing because we're so into repetitive lines. It's just we're too cheap in worship to encapsulate that story in song. It would almost have to be country music or something. You know what I mean? Because it's just too, you can't be just like, and my mom was the love of Jesus, and my mom was the love of Jesus, and my mom was the love of Jesus over and over again. It's more than that, because worship's more than that. And what it starts with is this: Jesus comes in the world and says, I'm going to appoint hey, I want to be with you. And more than that, I want you. And the reason that I want you and I want to be with you is because my Father wants me, and my Father wants to be with me. And before I ever do anything, I'm already blessed. Before my brother ever prayed the prayer, my mother already loved him. Before my brother ever prayed the prayer, my brother prayed the prayer with Kev in the hospital before I never got to hear it. But he prayed with him and said, I'm good, Dad. And that was so important for my dad. But he was already loved into eternity. He was already precious in God's sight. So if my parents are willing to give 53, maybe God's willing to give eternity. Right? To just care for us, for all of us. The process. And that's the beautiful thing about Paul's life yesterday, and that's why I shared on that today, is to me that's worship. It's not we find God. No, I wrote this poem years ago. That's not the good news. The good news is that God finds us. So who do we find? Well, we find ourselves eventually. hopefully. And when we do, we find the one who loved and found us long before we could love and find ourselves. For we are shaped and formed by the hands of God. We're loved long before we even know how to love. We're held long before we can even hold on. And like Jonah, even when we run from our calling, we most often just end up running right into it. Thank you, God, that you're in the interruption. You're in the space. You're in the bad day. You're in the good day. You're in the darkness. You're in the light. Actually, darkness is as light to you. Are there some things only the blind can see? God, in your great mercy, have you blinded me? I want to learn to trust you. I want to step into the night until the darkness is as light. Transform me as a worshiper, Lord, into what it all really means. Let me be open to the invitation in all the interruption. Let me be open to that deeper space of worship that is incarnation. And what we receive, Lord, from you, Lord, may we become. Or may what we receive, we do become. Lord, we love you. We're thankful. Amen.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. The message was recorded at the Awake Arise Advance Conference in 2023. If you would like to support our ministry, please consider a donation and be blessed.